Okay, so this week we begin the Parsha of Mashpatim, and we're going to be discussing the first section, which talks about the laws of slavery, specifically the laws pertaining to the Eved Ivri, the Hebrew slave. So, as we know, in the Jewish tradition, the concept of slavery was one of the great revolutions and one of the great contributions, where certainly in those days where slavery was very much commonplace, and even up to more recently in the US and in other jurisdictions where slavery was very much part of the society and the economy. And even till today, that phenomenon still persists in one way or another. And here, the very first thing the Torah teaches us after the giving of the Torah, which we learned about last week in the Parsha of Yisro, the very first laws it begins to talk about is the laws of slavery. And much has been spoken about this idea. Why was this picked as the very first? Certainly the Jewish people as a nation, they were just slaves a short while before that. But this is one of the great teachings of the Torah that teaches us how it's the whole thrust of these laws is really about curtailing and sort of mitigating, and ultimately to bring to a path of nullifying the notion of slavery. And thus, every single day, it's clearly very, very important for us. We make a blessing, Shelo Asani Aved, that we are not slaves. We thank Hashem that we are free. But the truth is, when we talk about slavery and the Eved Ivri, it is really, when we talk about slavery, it's not in the way it was in Jewish life. For a Jewish slave, they weren't like a slave that we are familiar with today with that notion. It was more in name more than in practice. The way it would work, there would generally be two possibilities, two ways that a person would become a slave. In one instance is a person, because of their abject poverty, impoverishment, they had no money, they would sell themselves as a slave. And a second possibility was if a person would steal and had no money to pay the money back, so then the Bezdin would sell this person and would live with their master and their family to be able to make up for the money that they stole. But this person would be able to live with a family. Instead of going to jail, they would live a dignified life with the family. And in the Torah perspective, what exactly does it, when we say to be a slave, there are many, many limitations and parameters. Ultimately, the notion of being a slave was not, as it was for many, a life designation. They were slaves, their children were slaves forever. Rather, when they would sell the person would be sold as a slave, it would only be time limited, only to 6 years. And even during those 6 years, if the person was able to, came upon funds to pay back to the owner what he paid for him, he'd be able to go free, even during those 6 years. And even the types of slavery or the types of work that the master can demand or subject the slave to was very limited. It had to be, the types of work had to be reasonable, had to be dignified. Master would not be able to give labor that was very, very demanding on their body, avodas perech, as it's called, or to give them undignified, demeaning, derogatory work that would be inhumane, as such as it's brought in halacha to carry his clothes to the Beis Hamerchatz, to the bathhouse. It's considered demeaning and humiliating. And he has all of the rights and all of the access to everything that the master has. He eats what the master eats. He drinks. He eats the same kind of bread. He would drink the same wine. He gets the same mattress with the same Tempur-Pedic, the same exact softness of the mattress and the thread count of his blanket, etc. Everything that the master has, he has access to, and thus the Gemara, the Talmud observes, Kolakona Eved Ivri, whoever acquires an Eved, Konal Adon Latzmo. In fact, what does he acquire for himself? A master. The master, through acquiring the slave, now he has all of these responsibilities. So ultimately, it's fascinating that the notion of being a slave, yes, of course, to be a slave is not, as we'll elaborate further, is not the ideal scenario, but it was a far, far cry from when we talk about slavery. The slave had rights. He had unbelievable access to all the things that he needed. And this is in the instance of a Eved Ivri, a Hebrew slave. There's a concept of Eved Knani, which is a different, although they also had many, many rights. Also, they had access to freedom. The master was not allowed to beat them, and if they would, there would be all kinds of consequences. And in the end, if certain times they would go free as a result, and if through the master's actions the slave would die, the master would be liable to with the death penalty as well. So broadly, we see this idea that all of the laws that the Torah talks about of slavery wasn't, as many seem to say, that it encourages and supports the concept of slavery. Rather, it's there to curtail and to create a parameter which ultimately would wean the people off the concept of slavery, especially as they were just slaves and were very sensitive to the concept of slavery. So what we're going to do, this is just a brief introduction, and we're going to study a few verses in the beginning of the Parsha Mashpatim, which can be introduced to a fascinating and very unusual procedure, which is known as the concept of Eved Nirtza. And that is, the Torah says, as we mentioned before, when you acquire a Hebrew slave, he would work for 6 years. So let's just read a few verses inside, beginning of the Parsha Mashpatim. These are the laws that you should set in place before them, the Jewish people. When you buy a Hebrew slave, 6 years he shall work, and on the 7th year, he goes out, he is released, he gets his freedom. So in the instance where this person, if this person comes to this slave, he comes into the he comes into the family not married. So then ultimately, when he is freed after 6 years, he also will not go with anybody with him. In other words, because there's a possibility where the master provides to the slave a woman, even a Canaanite woman, and they can have children because they all belong to, they're the property of the master. After 6 years, when he goes free, he does not go with the wife, and the children are not his, they remain with the master. And because of this, it gives rise to a dilemma. Pasuk Hey, we continue. Amar Yemer Evet. So he's able to go free after 6 years. Ahavti es Adoni es ishti vezbani. I love my master, my wife, and my children. Lo itze chavshi. So the problem is, after 6 years, he can't take this family with him. So he doesn't want to go free. He wants to remain with his master as a slave. So here we have this fascinating procedure. Vigisha Adonav El Holikim. So what happens? He brings the slave to the judges, the Jewish court. Vigisha Aladelas El Mezuzah. So then they bring the slave to a door which is connected to the doorpost. V'ratza Adonav es ozno b'martzeya ba'avodo le'olam. His master then pierces the right ear with a pointed tool, and then he serves his master. The wording of the Torah is la'olam, forever, but the rabbis teach us that la'olam doesn't mean for eternity, rather it means till the Jubilee, till the Yovel year. So here we have this fascinating procedure. He takes his ear and it is pierced, which we don't find this ritual in any other area of the Torah, any avera, any other transgression, anything that you do, you don't find this concept of piercing the ear. It's exclusively here in the scenario of the Eved Ivri. Now, the truth is, this was something that was pretty common in those times, because slaves, we know, all their masters would put a certain mark or a certain sign that they belonged to them, and if they would, sometimes they would try to run away, they would have that symbol or tattoo or other symbol that was indelibly marked in the skin or in some organ of theirs, which it would then be known who their master was. But we need to understand this whole procedure. It's very, very bizarre, and why it seems to be very degrading, very humiliating to subject this person to this kind of ear piercing by the door. So we have Rashi. Rashi helps us out a little bit on the explanation. He says that, first he says it's not clear. The Torah says you should pierce his ear as uzno. We don't know, is it the right ear or maybe it's the left ear? So he teaches, we learn out from the Mitzorah, where it says the word ozen, also says the word ear, uzno here, it says uzno there. By the Mitzorah, also they when it refers to the ear, it's the right one, so two here. Anyways, then he asks the question, for what reason was the ear chosen out of all the organs of the body to be bored? Why do we pierce that ear? So he brings a teaching of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said, the ear that heard on Har Sinai, lo signod, you shall not steal. Then this person proceeded and to steal. As we mentioned before, that there are two scenarios where a person would be sold, Eved Ivri would be sold. One was if that person was very, very poor and he had to sell himself into slavery, or there was the scenario where the person stole and didn't have the means to repay, and the Bezin would sell him to the master. So this person went and stole. What's the so in the case where he stole, it's because your ear heard by Har Sinai lo signo, and you went ahead and stole, therefore your ear will be bored. How about in the case of the slave who sold himself voluntarily into servitude? It wasn't due to theft. The reason that the ear is bored is because it is the ear that heard. Kili b'nei Yisrael avadim. Hashem said, for the children of Israel are slaves to me. And nevertheless, this person went and acquired a master for himself. So what are you becoming a slave to somebody else? You should be a slave to Hashem. Hashem says, you are my slave, not to be a slave to another slave. Because this person who is your master is really a slave of Hashem too. And then he brings a teaching of Rabbi Shimon, who says, why were the door and the doorpost singled out from all the fixtures of the house? Why are you using the door and the doorpost? You could go into the barn, you could go other places and bore a hole into his ear. Because he says, Hashem said, the door and the doorpost were witnesses in Mitzrayim. When I passed over the lintel and the two doorposts, as we know, by the Karban Pesach, they painted the mashkof and the mezuzah, the doorposts, and Hashem knew to pass over. They were witnesses when I said, for the children of the Bnei Yisrael are slaves. Right? Because Hashem said they are mine and therefore I am protecting them. But they are not to be slaves to slaves, and yet this person acquired himself a master. His ears shall be bored before them. They were the witnesses. They knew and saw this event, and therefore this person is pierced before the witnesses. This is the explanation of Rashi, which in a way, it helps us understand a bit why we are, why are we doing it specifically to the ear, and why before the doorpost. But it still raises a number of questions. Number one, Rashi is saying that, based on he's bringing this teaching, that the reason we pierce the ear is because the ear heard, thou shalt not steal. And therefore, we pierce the ear. But the problem here is that The only scenario where we pierce the ear is specifically in the case of a slave. Any person in general who steals, the Torah doesn't tell us that we pierce their ear. Why did we pick specifically in the case of a slave who stole? And question number 2 is, when do we pierce their ear? If a person steals and he can't repay, so he's sold as a slave, and he stays there for 6 years. After 6 years, as we mentioned, he goes free. And if he decides after 6 years to remain, it is only then that we pierce his ear. So meaning to say, if the person were to steal and works for 6 years and goes free, his ear is not pierced. But hang on a second. The reason why we pierce his ear is because the person stole 6 years earlier, or he sold himself into slavery. So why do we wait 6 years? We should pierce the ear right away. As soon as the person steals and is sold into slavery, for those 2 reasons, as we mentioned from Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, that is why we should pierce his ear. Why do we wait 6 years? And another question is, Rashi typically, when he brings an explanation, he doesn't mention the name of who was the sage who gave over that teaching. He only quotes the name when somehow the name of that sage or that teacher, that rabbi, lends insight and appreciation to the teaching. So why does he mention that this teaching was from Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, as we'll soon see? So here we go to explain this idea. And that is, as we mentioned before, there's nothing more abhorrent, more loathsome in the Torah and Judaic perspective as the notion of slavery. There's nothing more subhuman, there's nothing more that the Torah says we should loathe and despise. Why is that? What's so bad about a slave and slavery in general? This is a person that gives away their free choice. Even though, as we mentioned before, the Torah curtails and limits the parameters of slavery to the extent that, as we mentioned before in the Talmud's observation, one who acquires a slave has acquired a master. You have to do everything for them. They are eating the same menu. They have to sleep on the same level of the bedding, everything. So, and as we mentioned before, you're not allowed to ask them to do any degrading or demeaning work. So in a way, you could say a slave is like an employee. You have to, they have all these rights and respects. They're unionized by the Torah. You have to give them, you have to accommodate them, you have to have reasonable work, and you have to feed them, take care of them. So why do we even look at this person as a slave? We should look at this person like an employee. What's the difference between the Eved Ivri and a Sachir, an employee from the Torah worldview? The reason is because an employee, every single day, he can make a choice. I'll go back and work for this person, or I quit, I'll move on. Ultimately, this employee controls their life. Yes, when he has to work, when he has to fulfill the tasks that he is hired to do, so he has to abide by certain regulations. But inherently, he has a choice at any second to walk out. The slave has totally surrendered any sort of freedom in their life to an outside force. The master ultimately decides every single day what time you're going to get up, what kind of work you're going to do. There is no individuality. There is no uniqueness to this person. There is no aspiration. There's no ambition, nothing. His whole life is decided for. There's no decisions you have to make. That's why many times when people are taken out of such a scenario, and we see this even with the Bnei Yisrael when they left the desert, it is very hard to live a life of freedom once a prisoner comes out of jail, because they're used to the routine. Someone telling them what time is dinner, what time is the meals, what time they're going out, what time they're doing everything. It's it's a life that you don't have to make any decisions. Once you have that responsibility, sometimes it's very, very hard to live with. This slave has now no free choice. They're just like a piece of furniture. You move it around without no input, no say in the matter. And therefore, ultimately, this is a person without bechira, without choice. And this is very, very much antithetical to the vision of the Torah, to the end. And as the Torah is trying to inculcate in each and every one of us, imagine we say, you're not in charge of your life. Someone else is making decisions. How are we to stand up to temptation, to routine, to all kinds of challenges, and say, you know what, I am going to give up. I'm going to allow my addictions, my challenges, my insecurities to take over my life. I'm worried about what my neighbor is going to say, what my boss is going to tell me, all of these things which are controlling my life. If I don't assert control, I don't assert my will upon my challenge, my circumstance, you're essentially a slave, because you're not allowing yourself to determine your destiny, your path ahead. It is others that are doing it for you. How could you envision a life of Torah where a person is encouraged and commanded to work on their character, to work in their challenge and their struggle and self-refinement? If they are not to take responsibility and not in control of any of that, it is unfathomable, the whole concept of Torah, of observing mitzvahs. Indeed, a slave is exempt from fulfilling time-related mitzvahs. So ultimately, what is the Torah teaching us here? Slavery is something that we detest, something that is totally against everything the Torah stands for. And therefore, when a person sells themselves into slavery, they should be subject to a very humiliating experience to ultimately make a statement. What separates the human being from an animal? It is their bechira, it is their choice. It is their consciousness. It's their conscience which tells them what is right and what is wrong, what is good and what is bad. And it is only when you have the ability to make that choice, when you're not a slave, you are truly a human being. And therefore, a person who has decided to sell themselves into slavery really should be subject to that humiliation, to make that clear statement that what you're doing is degrading yourself to a subhuman level. However, the truth is that it's possible to take another look at the story of this slave and sympathize with them. This person, why did they sell themselves into slavery? They were poor. He had no money. He had nothing to eat for himself. Maybe he had a family. He couldn't feed them. And for him, he decided there is no other choice. There was nothing else he could do but sell themselves into slavery. So therefore, perhaps we shouldn't think that this person gave up all of his rights and all of his freedom and liberties. We shouldn't look down on them. We should empathize. He had no choice. He was crushed and broken by his dire circumstance, and he saw no other way but to sell himself. And therefore, the truth is, we could actually, the way we study the Rashi, we could see that perhaps this piercing of the ear is not such a terrible thing. In fact, in those days, body piercings, and certainly on the ear, was of the norm. Even today, the fact that we pierce somebody's ear shouldn't be seen as such a humiliating experience. And the Rebbe says, when he analyzes Rashi, we can even see it from the fact that Rashi says, do we pierce the right ear or do we pierce the left ear? What's Rashi debating over here? Because he says, maybe it's actually the left ear. As we just learned in the Parsha of Bo, that when the Torah commands us to put on, you bind the tefillin onto your hands. Which hand is it? It is on the left hand. Why? Because yadcha can be read as yad keha, the weaker hand. So in other words, the left, in the generally speaking, and not to our people are lefties, but in the Torah perspective, when we refer to left, that could be seen as the weaker hand comparison to the right. And therefore, Rashi says maybe when we pierce the left ear, when we pierce the ear, it is specifically the left one, not the right one, because perhaps it's such a benign thing that we're piercing the ear, and even which ear will we do it is perhaps the less important ear, so to speak. This goes to show how Rashi was viewing this whole piercing of the ear as not such a humiliating and horrific punishment as we might assume. However, in the end, what happens? The person, we said, let's be malamed zchus, let's advocate and let's see the positive in this person. They didn't go to slavery because they wanted to, and they weren't going against the grain of what Hashem was trying to teach them. Rather, they had no other choice. So we say, okay, that is why we don't pierce the ear. Remember, we had the question, if the whole purpose of piercing the ear is because the ear that heard at Har Sinai not to steal, or the ear that heard at Har Sinai not to be a slave, right, which covered the two cases, either stealing, which the Bezdin sells you, or to sell yourself as a slave, which you're not supposed to be a slave to another slave, you're supposed to be a slave to Hashem. We ask the question, if that is the reason why we pierce the ear, it should be right away in the beginning of 6 years, not at the end. The answer is because it's possible. At the beginning of the 6 years, we don't blame this person. We are not so judgmental. Perhaps he was sold into slavery, it was beyond his control. And therefore, we wait 6 years. And at the end of the 6 years, what happens? Now, this person says, I love my master, I love my wife, I love my children. What is this showing to us? This person has the opportunity to go free. There's all kinds of possibilities now. As the Kli Yakar explains, what's the significance of piercing his ear by the door? The door is the door to freedom. It's his way out. It's the possibility that now he can pursue all of his dreams, all of his ambitions, take responsibility for his life, and go free. And yet this person shuns that. This person says, I don't want to go out that door. So now, what does this show us? Not just, okay, this person wants to remain a slave. It goes back. We see retroactively what happened in the past 6 years. Why did he truly sell himself? He didn't do it because out of his abject poverty. There's something more. He doesn't mind surrendering his rights. He doesn't mind surrendering his freedom. And therefore, we pierce his ear. Because what happened? This ear was at Har Sinai. What happened at Har Sinai? At Har Sinai, it was manifestly apparent to every single Jew. They saw Hashem. They felt, as we read in this past last week's Parsha, this past Shabbos on Parshas Yisro, they felt the presence of Hashem, and they were totally blown away. Without a doubt, everyone knew and understood and felt Hashem in their lives. They should have known a person is in poverty, Hashem will take care of you. So what does it mean? This person who sold himself into slavery means he doesn't believe that Hashem will provide. That means the whole Sinai experience, what was the point of it? So we pierced the ear to show this ear listened and heard everything. And yet, nevertheless, it wasn't enough to prevent this person from selling themselves into slavery, to surrender everything and say, you know what, I give up. Let someone else run my life for me. Let someone else make those decisions because I don't believe Hashem can take me out of this predicament. We pierced the ear. And therefore, we both the person who sold himself or the person who stole, they have declared that the experience at Har Sinai wasn't transformative enough. And therefore, we pierced the ear as a signal that this ear, whatever it heard, was futile, it was worthless, it was pointless. However, you could still make an argument and say, you know what? True. This person is, listen, in the beginning of the 6 years, why did he sell himself into slavery? He didn't really want being a slave. He had no choice. He had no money. He had no funds. He was desperate. It only, not retroactively for 6 years. Yes, after 6 years, listen, he got married. He had a wife. He had children. He grew attached to them. So it's possible. We're not saying that was the first reason. Yes, now he has become part of the routine. He's enjoying it. That doesn't mean necessarily for 6 years. That's the reason why he did it. Perhaps only later. And so still we should sympathize because a person gets accustomed and a person becomes habituated to their environment and their milieu. Perhaps we should still sympathize. Why are we really piercing the ear? The Rebbe says this is why Rashi brings the name of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, as we shall soon see, is a model, is a paradigm for a person who teaches us that no matter what the circumstance, this is a person who teaches us that we always are able to overcome any challenge or any difficulty, that it is impossible to enslave and to bring down a Jew. They will always overcome, they will always rise to the top. As we know, the story of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, he lived in the time of the Churban of the second Beis Hamikdash. The Talmud in Gittin discusses at length, devotes several pages to tell us that the very dire circumstance was then. They were under siege by the Romans for a very long time. There was no food. There were no prospects. Talmud tells us how there was this very rich Jerusalemite woman who sent out her slave to find something to eat. And there was literally nothing. She sent him to find flour, fine flour. He came back. He said, there's no fine flour. Let's find more non-fine flour. But he couldn't find nothing. There was no food. And therefore, she went out on the street and ate. There was something, a fig that was eaten by something else. And she was so grossed out by that. And she died. It was a very, very terrible situation. And there was a big struggle between the establishment, between the rabbis who said, we have to appease the Romans. And there was the Biryonim, the Zealots, who said, no, we got to fight. But Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, he persevered. And it's a long story how he was able to be smuggled out of Jerusalem, even though the Biryonim, these Zealots, did not want anyone to go out and try to negotiate with the Romans. It's a whole story how he feigned his illness and his death, and they brought him out in a coffin, and he encounters, at that time, there was Vespasian, was the general of the army. And ultimately, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was able to negotiate some very, very important things from this Roman general, special conditions to save the Yavne and to establish a yeshiva there, which the Romans didn't realize was ultimately going to guarantee the survival and the eternity of the Jewish people, because they were able to build the yeshiva and it was able to survive the Churban. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, he is a model of perseverance because he had every excuse. Jerusalem, the whole Eretz Yisrael was crumbling. There was no food. They were on the verge of total decimation, annihilation. And yet, he didn't give in. He crafted a very, very important long-term program that ensured the survival of the Jewish people. So no matter what his circumstance, no matter where he was not cowed, he was not in any way subordinate to the circumstance. He stood up for what he knew was right, no matter the cost. And this teaches us to the slave. Yes, you're going to say, I have this excuse. I was enjoying my time. It was amazing. It was beautiful, these years with this wife. And I want to go, now I don't want to go anymore. I'm enjoying it. But this is not an excuse, because ultimately we have to know that no matter the condition, no matter the circumstance, ultimately we have within us the spirit that can overcome. And the Rebbe provides an interesting lesson from the story of the Eved Nirtza, and that is the 6 years of slavery, and on the 7th year you go free. This parallels the person in their lifetime, in their careers. We all have the 6. There's the 6 days of the week that we work. We have our jobs, our careers, our life. And we are somewhat a slave. We have become very much focused on the here and now, and we don't see the big picture, and we're constantly working and we're chasing, and it's the rat race of life. And Hashem gives us that 7th year, that 7th day, which is Shabbos, which we could go free. We go to freedom. We have our 6 years, we put in our time, but on the 7th day, it's the time that we release, we forget it all, and we reunite and reconnect with our inner core. The problem is it comes the seventh day of Shabbos, and for some, they say, you know what? I love those 6 days of the week, being a slave to my job and to my life and to my career and to all of those things in life. I don't want the seventh day. So Hashem says, hang on a second. If you had the 6 days and you're doing your work, I understand. You need to. You're a slave, right? You're committed. You have your deadlines. You have your schedules. You need to do that. I get that. But what about the seventh day? Why can't you rest? Why can't you focus exclusively on yourself and your family and your friends and look inwards and rehabilitate your inner freedom, your inner liberation? But some people say, no, I love my master, I love my wife, I love my children, meaning to say, I've become so ingrained in the slavery that you know what, this is my life, this is who I am. I'm gonna be the slave also on the seventh day. So Hashem says, you know what this teaches me? That not only on the seventh day you're the slave, even those 6 days, I thought, okay, this was a process you had to go through, but you knew who your true master was. Your true master was Hashem. But now I see you're a slave to a slave. You're not really seeing that everything in life is orchestrated and run by Hashem. And this is true the 6 days of the week and the seventh day of Shabbat. We have the 6 millennia, and we are working through, we've been in this gullus, we've been in this servitude, and there will be the 7th millennia, the 7th day of Shabbos, which is when Mashiach will come, which is what we're aspiring and looking forward to. And this teaches us that many, many times, what does it mean to be a slave? It's not just a person who's wearing chains and a master is standing there with a whip. We become slaves, that sometimes there are things that are urgent and there are things that are important. And we confuse, sometimes we dismiss and we push off the things that are important because there's something urgent. I have to answer this, I have to do this, I have to do that. But we lose focus on what's truly important in life. And the Torah is telling us is that if we become a slave to the urgent, to the instantaneous, then we realize that we're forgetting who is truly our master. And it can have a very, very difficult repercussions in life. There was this rabbi who was once in charge. He was presiding over a chuppah in one of these destination weddings. And before they proceed with the chuppah, they're looking for the witnesses you need to have 2 witnesses to witness to aid him to witness the whole ritual, the whole transaction of the chuppah. And one of them was missing. And the rabbi's looking around, and it was pretty much a very secular, non-religious crowd. And they were missing one of the witnesses. And the rabbi says, when people are, what's going on? What's the delay? He says, unfortunately, we cannot proceed with this chuppah because we are missing one of our witnesses. Everything, they're ready, the flowers, the caterer, everything. So one of the participants comes over and says, Rabbi, tell me, why anyone could be a witness? What's the problem? He says, well, in order to be a witness, you need to be a shomer Torah mitzvahs. You need to be an observant Jew. And we don't have another one of those people, and therefore we cannot proceed with the chuppah. So this person thinks for a second, so tell me, Rabbi, what will it entail to be a Torah observant Jew? He says, well, you need to decide that you will be, primarily, you can start keeping Shabbat. Shabbat, there's kosher, you're going to start keeping it from now on. So the man thinks to himself for a second, you know what? I am going to do this. This is going to be my gift to the chassan and kala. I will be a shomer Torah mitzvahs. This is what I'm going to do. And we can proceed with the chuppah. So the rabbi says, are you positive you're going to do this? He said, yes. And the rabbi says, okay, we are ready to proceed. And they go ahead and they do the chuppah, they do the wedding. Several years later, this rabbi, he is in Eretz Yisrael, he's standing by the kosel, and someone comes over and says, Rabbi, Shalom Aleichem. He didn't recognize a person with looked very religious looking with a beard. He says, tell me, who are you? He says, do you remember several years ago there was a wedding in this destination, and you needed an aid, you needed a witness? That's me. He says, wow, it's unbelievable. You look like totally like a different person. He says, Rabbi, the truth is, I wanted to thank you very much for all that you did for me. He says, what do you mean? What are you talking about? He says, what you did saved my life. You saved my family. You saved my marriage. You saved it all. He says, what are you talking about? He says, well, prior to that wedding, things were going downhill. The relationship was falling apart with the kids. I was so consumed with work and business, and everything was slowly slipping away. But you told me that one of the critical ingredients of being an observant Jew is to keep the Shabbat. He says, you have no idea how closing everything and focusing on my wife and my children and every week, it really strengthened and enhanced our relationship. And it's unbelievable. And I cannot imagine without this if we would all still be together today. And indeed, this teaches us a very powerful lesson that ultimately this concept of being the indentured slave is something that each and every one of us experience in life. And the Torah is telling us that ultimately we have to realize sometimes we're a slave. We're a slave to what other people think. We're totally surrendering our own dreams and aspirations because we're afraid of something, or we think we have this commitment, or we have to behave this way or that way. Ultimately, there is one master. There is one person who controls everything. And when we submit to him, we submit to Hashem, then automatically everything in life is about our choice. We realize that it's not just we're deciding, we have Hashem who is helping us, guiding us in every aspect and detail of our life. And through the 6 days of the week and the 6th millennia, we enter into the Shabbat, the time of Mashiach, which we experience the true freedom. Our neshama, our soul, is able to soar and fully manifest all of our potential. May we all merit to that time very speedily soon, the coming of Mashiach. Amen.